Good evening. I am the Reverend Diane Daugert, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashville for the annual Palmer Lecture, which has been taking place since 1983. Unitarian Universalism is a living tradition. We gather around 7 principles which guide us in our ethical, moral, and spiritual lives. The Palmer Lecture is an embodiment of our intellectual and spiritual curiosity and our deeply felt call to faithful action in the world. We are delighted to have Rasheedat Fetuga delivering the Palmer Lecture this evening. She has graciously agreed to be available to take questions for 15 minutes following the lecture. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening. My name is Kyle Mothers, and I'm a member of this congregation. I'm here to introduce my friend, Ms. Rasheedat Fetuga, who's the speaker tonight. But first, just a tiny bit about me. So I am a civil rights attorney here in Nashville. And from 2017 to 2019, I represented First UU with Nashville Organized for Action and Hope. And I was the co-chair of NOAA's Criminal Justice Task Force during that period. As a civil rights lawyer, I've been involved with a lot of federal lawsuits against the city involving the police department, including currently the pending case by Daniel Hambrick's family, stemming from Mr. Hambrick being shot and killed from behind by a Metro Nashville police officer back in 2018. So I met Rasheedat back in 2016 when we collaborated on the Driving While Black report together. Rasheedat is the visionary leader of Gideon's Army, which is a grassroots community organization that's been a major driving force in Nashville for the past several years. Rasheedat and Gideon's Army have led on restorative justice programs for children, both at the public school and in the juvenile justice system. In 2016, it was Gideon's Army that organized the team that developed and published the Driving While Black report, which became a huge catalyst for change in the police department. Ultimately, traffic stops since have been reduced by over 50% overall. Rasheedat and Gideon's Army have, in the last few years, pioneered violence interrupter programs that get out into the community and use outreach and connection and healing to disrupt cycles of violence and vendetta. And in the spring of this past year, after the tornado hit, Rasheedat and Gideon's Army organized tornado relief efforts that got hundreds of volunteers and all kinds of supplies out to affected families and to children who had been displaced by the tornado to make sure that their basic needs were met. So, what's so extraordinary about Rasheedat, and you'll see this shortly, she is doing all this amazing work from a place of love. That's where she's coming from. You can see that when she talks to you, she will hear you, and she will see you, and you're gonna be able to feel her warmth and her compassion and her empathy, and you will know, that this is all coming from her heart. And so, with that, I am proud to introduce my friend to you, Ms. Rasheedat Fetuga.
Hello, everyone. It is such an honor to be here with you all today. I want to thank you for having me as your Palmer lecturer today. My name is Rasheedat Fetuga, and I am the founder of Gideon's Army, Grassroots Army for Children. I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay, it's not working. Let's see. Let me do it this way. Okay, so Today, I am here to talk with you all about healing justice. What does it mean to look at justice from a different perspective, from criminalization and punishment and blame, and transform it to looking at how do we heal people who've been harmed in situations? How do we help to rehabilitate people who've caused harm? Or, sometimes people don't even necessarily need rehabilitation, but just support in order to live their best lives. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we do, I want to tell you a little bit about myself and about how Gideon's Army started. So Gideon's Army started really in September of 2010 when one of my students, Lamar Hughes, was killed. Lamar was one of my, Lamar was actually never one of my students. I was his older brother's teacher at Carter Lawrence Math and Science Magnet School. I taught for Metro Nashville Public Schools for 8 years, and I was a fourth grade teacher. When Lamar was in like the third grade and fourth grade, he was just getting in so much trouble. And I watched him, continually being suspended and expelled and just kind of in and out of this cycle of being brought back into class and kicked out of class. And so I went to the principal and I asked her, can you please let me take care of him? I already had a relationship with the family, home visits. I spent a lot of time with Lamar, his sister, his brother, his mother, his stepfather, and his stepbrother as well. And so instead of suspending him, Lamar was sent to my room. And there was one day that Lamar had gotten into trouble, and he said, Miss Fetuga, I am trying so hard, but I don't really think that I will live to see 18. And when he told me that, it was something in the weight of what this little 8-year-old boy said. He was 8. He was so little and small with this big personality, and he's looking at me and he's telling me that he does not see a life past 18 years old. This is an 8-year-old boy. Now, I had been mentored by Miss Marian Wright Edelman, civil rights leaders. I understood theoretically the school to prison pipeline. I watched it growing up as a Black girl in the inner city, but, I didn't really experience it directly myself. I never been suspended. I did ISS once for punching Brandon Cole in the nose, for calling me cupcake in the lunch line. But, none of the experiences that our children face that have them continually kicked out and pushed out of the classroom. And so my experiences as a teacher, it made everything that I learned from Mrs. Edelman, it made it come to life in a different way. Because what I saw was in my classroom, in 8 years of teaching, I sent one child to the office. One child to the office. His name was Gideon, and he had kind of kicked me a little. And it wasn't that I couldn't handle the situation. It was more so that I wasn't in the mood that day. I'm like, you know what, Gideon, you can just go to the office. I'm not doing this with you today. I sent him to the office, and guess what happened? Gideon ate chocolate-covered strawberries while he was in the office. He came back with chocolate-covered strawberries, chocolate on his mouth, and he knew, because my children know me better than anybody, that I love chocolate-covered strawberries. So he was rubbing it in. He was rubbing it in and just like, ha ha, Miss Fetuga, this is what happens when you go to the office. But then maybe an hour later, the principal came to my classroom and she asked me if I wanted to press charges against a 10-year-old boy who had only slightly kicked me, who spent all day in the office eating chocolate-covered strawberries to come back, rub it in my face, and then I have a right to press charges against him. So he had no real consequences, no accountability. There was no focus even on the relationship that he and I had that would cause the breakdown for me to even not feel like dealing with his mess that day. And that was my second year teaching. And in that moment, I remember thinking, these people are crazy. Like, I felt that I couldn't trust the leadership of the school at that time to really look out for the best interest of the children. This was my second year teaching. Now, fast forward maybe 3 or 4 years, I'm sitting with Lamar, and he tells me that he doesn't think that he's going to live to see 18. He tells me that the way that teachers handle him, it just doesn't really feel fair to him, that he can try and try and try, but sitting at a desk, turning to page 385 and doing numbers 1 through 10, it doesn't work for him. And when he has a hard time sitting there, or if he forgets to raise his hand and he calls out and he gets kicked out the classroom, he really felt defeated. But on top of that, he says, Miss Fetuga, look at my life. We walk over dead bodies to school some mornings. What all do you expect from me? What do you expect from us? And so that really hit my spirit. And for, that year, 2 years while he was in elementary school, I did absolutely everything that I could to keep Lamar safe, to, work with his family, to try to give him like as much love and care and support as I could. When it was time for him to go to 4th grade, he wasn't allowed to be in my classroom, even though I was the main source of safety for him at the school, because so many children requested my classroom. There was a rule that there could be no requests. And so they pretty much just placed him wherever, and the classroom where he was placed, it just wasn't a good fit for him at all. So 4th grade, go into middle school, and I lose contact. I try for years to find Lamar. And then one day there's the Edge Hill Night Out Against Crime. And who do I see? Lamar Hughes. After years of knocking on doors, making phone calls, trying to find him, trying to find his family, here comes Lamar and his brother walking across the street. And he comes up to me. We greet each other. We hug. I'm like, Lamar, Floyd. And at the time, he had like these mid-length locks. They were so moisturized and beautiful. And I remember running my fingers through his hair and just asking him, like, how has he been? And asking his brother. And they told me the reason I couldn't find them is because they had gotten in trouble in public housing. They had gotten evicted, moved in with their grandmother, and that he had pretty much just been in and out of the justice system, school to prison pipeline. Not enough supports, like community-based supports, and more criminalization and punishment for really just being in unhealthy environments and doing everything that you can to survive. So we hug and we kiss, and I tell him, I'm going to see you. We exchange phone numbers, and we're parting ways. He's crossing the street. I'm continuing to go in a direction that I was going. We're going in opposite directions. And what he said to me when he was 8 years old, it hit my spirit in that moment. And I turned around and I said, Lamar. He said, Miss Fetuga. I said, how old are you? He said, 16. And in my heart, I'm like, maybe I have 2 more years to be able to support him and to turn his life around, help him turn his life around. I don't dare to think that I have the power to just transform someone's life, but I know the power of love and support and transforming communities and helping people to be self-empowered to do those things. And so we said our goodbyes, blew kisses, and I want to say maybe 2 months later, Lamar was gunned down in broad daylight in Edge Hill, standing with his mother, and my baby was gone. It really still hurts me today, as much as I really just try to get over it and to deal with it. There is really no kind of pain to explain losing a child. And I know that I wasn't his mother, but the connection that I had with him was very maternal. I won't say that I grieve in the way that she grieves, but I will tell you that I grieve for him harder than I've ever hurt for anything or anybody in my entire life. And I stood at his funeral, and I just said, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to dedicate my entire existence to doing all I can to save our children. And in that moment, Gideon's Army was born. I often say that in a lot of ways, it seems that Lamar gave his life so that I could find mine, because I imagine that I could have easily been maybe misdirected or taken another path, but Lamar was definitely a catalyst for me to find my life's purpose. And some of it was atoning. Some of it was completely atoning for not being able to save a child that I love so much. It was a way of healing, finding healing, occupying my time and my mind so that I wasn't consumed with grief. But after Lamar was killed, a couple months later, Tevin Scruggs, Mikhail Shakir, Kenny Hatcher, Jacquees, like so many of my children whose noses I wiped, whose shoes I tied, whose homes I visited, who I held and cradled in my arms, just dying on the streets. And school to prison pipeline began to mean something different to me. It didn't stop at prison. It was costing our children their lives. And in that pain, in that understanding, in that deeper knowing, Gideon's Army was born. And so who are we? Gideon's Army is a grassroots organization. Grassroots meaning that it is people who are impacted by the issues that we focus on: school to prison pipeline, racial injustice and inequity, youth violence. It is people who are impacted by those issues who lead the actual work. So things that we focus on: prevention, peacemaking, youth leadership and development, family development, community building. We focus on alternatives to traditional justice that are more research-based and impactful, because what we find is that traditional justice just doesn't work. And so it's really almost insane to continue to do something that we know people will continue to go in this cycle of going back to jail and not really being able to get on their feet. And so how can we think creatively and create programs and models that restore the people who've been harmed, but also help folks get on their feet and point them in the direction that they need to go? We focus on stakeholder decision-making and restoration. And so again, people who have been impacted by these issues, they are the decision makers within our organization. They are the leaders, people who are formerly incarcerated, people who are sex workers, former sex workers, people who've been addicted to drugs, people who have been kicked out of school, part of the prison pipeline. Anybody who's had any of these experiences, these are the masterminds behind Gideon's Army. We focus on taking care of those who've been harmed by violence, who've been harmed by racial injustice, who've been harmed by, just living in unhealthy communities. But we also make sure that we care and focus on rehabilitation for those who have caused harm. And what makes Gideon's Army unique is that we understand restorative justice in a different way. We are an organization that's focused on restorative justice, and I'll go into that shortly. But we understand that restorative justice also has to be transformational, that you can't take out the transformational aspect of what restorative justice is. And what that means is that it naturally shifts the relationship between the people and the government. If we're talking about that our country is a democracy and it is for the people, by the people, then that is exactly what Gideon's Army is. That is what we stand on, and that is what we create. And then we focus on reentry and what we call civic engagement, which can be direct action. It can be facilitating circles. It can be speaking truth to power. Civic engagement looks a lot of different ways depending on what it is that we're focusing on. So Gideon's Army is a restorative justice organization. And this is really important to understand as we're talking about healing justice, because this really is what healing justice is. It's a philosophy, it's a way of life, it's an ethos that's built on a foundation of true community caring, relationship building, culture change, and it focuses on how to create social determinants of health within communities and healthy systems, and not necessarily transforming the current traditional justice system, but also building, or specifically and especially building, systems outside of our traditional justice system. So our focus is on collective healing, rebuilding of trust, deep care, rehabilitation when harm is caused. And so Gideon's Army focuses primarily in 4 different areas: schools, courts, policing, and community. And what I'm going to do is, in this presentation, I'm going to take you through like these 4 components and explain to you really how healing justice looks, or what healing justice looks like in these 4 areas. And so I want to ask you all just a rhetorical question, something that I want you to think about while I'm talking. How many of you have been hurt by someone? How many of you, which we don't use the words victim and offender, and so we exchange those with harm caused, harm experienced. How many of you have experienced harm that could have been even from a crime? But it doesn't have to be. Think about what you needed. Think about what you needed when that harm was caused. If you've been harmed, maybe it's understanding, for the person to acknowledge that they've caused the harm, for them to figure out a way to make things right. Maybe you need time alone. Maybe you need time with family. Maybe you need an opportunity to be able to speak your truth. Maybe that's something that you struggle with, and it would be empowering to have someone to support you to be able to do that. Now I'm going to ask you, have you ever hurt anyone? Have you ever personally caused harm to anyone in your life? And I want you to think about what you needed in that situation. Because a lot of times when we look at crime, when we look at criminalization, there's a separation between the person who's caused harm and us. And it's so much easier to have an opinion of really hell and damnation for someone who's caused harm when we aren't the one who's caused the harm. So it's easier to look at somebody and look at their mugshot. For example, there were people who thought that Lamar deserved to die. If you look at the news stories, it's only his mugshot. He's presented as a formal, as a criminal, as a thug, all of these things, not understanding that Lamar gambled because they had rent to pay. That there were so many stories in Edge Hill of how he would shoot dice, take the money, and go buy groceries for the single moms in the community. But because he was a child, he would buy bologna and bread and Kool-Aid and chips. They don't tell those stories. People become dehumanized, and the harm that is caused becomes what defines them, when really we are so much more than the harm that we've caused. So my question is, have you ever hurt anyone? And what did you need in that situation? Now, this is assuming that you accept responsibility for the harm that you've caused, because it doesn't help. You know, the internet loves the word narcissistic and narcissism. It doesn't help to be narcissistic if you've caused harm and you don't acknowledge that you've caused this harm. You don't acknowledge that you've hurt someone. But let's say that you have hurt someone and you're willing to accept responsibility. What did you need? Do you want to be thrown away? Do you want to be defined forever the harm that you've caused someone? Did you maybe want to be able to make things right? An apology, returning what was taken, whether it be, dignity or a wallet. What did you want and what did you need? And so when we're looking at restorative justice, when we're looking at healing justice, we're looking at what is the person who's been harmed? What is it that they need in order to rebuild a sense of safety? What do they need to feel that the harm has been repaired? But it's not just about the person who's been harmed and the person who's caused the harm. We're looking at things from a community perspective, and it's really indigenous to who we are. And Gideon's Army is a Black-led and a Black-focused organization. And, restorative justice is really indigenous to who we are as a people, no matter where we come from, sitting in a circle and figuring out how to work together to make things right. So everyone who's been impacted, everyone, the community, everyone comes together in the circle to figure out, what do we do to regain a sense of safety within this community, to help this person who's been harmed to feel cared for, and then also the person who's caused harm. How do we focus on them as well and help them make things right and earn back the trust from the community and get them on a path to success? And so Gideon's Army's mission is to act collectively, boldly, and strategically as a unified force for all children, placing children first. We eliminate the root causes of violence, save our children from death and incarceration, and guide them on a secure path to success. We will not stop until the pipeline is dismantled. We will not quit on our children. So in 2015, Nashville experienced a surge in violence between 14 and 25-year-olds, primarily in North Nashville, Casey, Sudacum, Napier communities. There were over 16,000 incidents of violence involving Nashville youth ages 25 and under in a 6-year period. 39 of those cases were youth homicides. A total of 78 people were killed that year, making young people 50% of all murder victims in the city. But not only were youth the ones who were being killed, they were also the ones who were committing the murders. So they were youth ages 25 and younger. And so this is where Gideon's Army really began to look at youth violence and focus in to begin to understand what healing justice would look like in instances of community violence. And what we learned is to look at violence as a social determinant of health. So as you can see on the screen here, that the negative effects of violence on social determinants of health, it's like a cycle. So education, economic conditions, healthcare, the physical environment, community resources, community cohesion, all of these things impact violence, but violence also cycles around and impacts all of these things. And so if you can't control and kind of stop the bleeding, stop the violence, then it's really hard to build these other determinants of health. But without building the determinants of health, it's really almost impossible to stop the violence. So it's kind of like, which comes first, the chicken or the egg, which we know having unhealthy communities is really what creates the violence. And it impacts, having these unhealthy communities and the violence, it always creates more violence. And so what we learned is that violence in Nashville was an epidemic and that it needed to be treated like a public health issue. And what that means is looking at the issues from a perspective of it being population-based and not just looking at, this person is committed a crime and something needs to be done about them. Instead, we're looking at root causes that can be changed, or what we call modifiable root causes. The public health perspective is rooted in risk factors, protective factors, risk factors meaning, what puts people in the community at risk. And what can we do to protect, to create protective factors that builds resilience and builds cohesion and community self-efficacy and all of these things. And it also looks at the impact of families, communities, and large populations. And so we understand that violence is a public health issue. If we're looking at it from a public health issue, then it would make sense to look at alternatives and say, what could healing justice look like if we're addressing youth violence? Public health issue, healing justice. It really makes sense. So understanding modifiable contributors to violence, you have individual, interpersonal, organizational, community, and policy. And the reason it's important to also include policy is because, again, a lot of people separate restorative justice and transformational justice. But if you're really looking at justice that restores and justice that heals, we have to also look at the violence that is committed against people of color, poor people, people in the LGBTQ plus community, people with disabilities. Like, there are so many risk factors that are put on specific demographics. And if we're looking at healing, then we also have to look at, we have to look at the impacts of violence and oppression on these groups in order to really have justice that really restores, if that makes sense. So when you're looking on an individual level, how people accept violence, like how it's normalized, apathy, conflict resolution, substance abuse, mental illness, all of these things. Interpersonal is like, what kind of social support system do our youth have? Have they experienced past abuse? Has someone in their family been killed due to violence? Because we all know we've heard the saying, hurt people hurt people. Then there's organizational, employment opportunities, other prevention efforts that are from other, organizations, and then community. What type of violence is happening in the community? What are the levels of poverty? What kind of inequality and inequities exist within the community? How many or what level of economic opportunities exist? What does policing look like in these communities? Are they being over-policed? Or are there alternatives that help and rehabilitate and really take care of people? And then when we look at policies, how are crimes prosecuted? How supportive is government of these alternative programs, these healing justice programs? And also, outside of the system, what kind of programs exist for people to go to and maybe not even deal with the current policies that exist? And so what that means is, if you experience something in your community, you may not want to call the police. Maybe you'll call a violence interrupter. Maybe you'll call that person's parent, or, you'll do something within the community to address the harm that's been caused. And so what Gideon's Army did is we created a system. So I always tell people, this is my brain on paper, and I'm not going to go into it. But what is important to understand is, if we're going to have healing justice, it has to be systemic. Like, it has to be community-based, community-focused, community-led, but it has to have structure. There has to be a structure in place that doesn't mimic the current justice system, but making sure that there's, enough volunteers, the community members are trained, that we're looking at prevention as well as intervention. And so there are 3 principles that we look at to make sure that our programs are deeply focused on healing justice. The first is repairing harm. Making sure that whatever wrong that's been done is made right, even if it has to be made right over time. And in making it right, there has been a collective decision. People have come together, which leads me into the second principle, which is stakeholder involvement. We aren't looking at just the one-on-one, we're looking at the community. And when you bring the community together, there's not only healing of individuals, there becomes healing of families, healing of community. Then you've got, the broader society. And really, if you look at North Nashville, or if you take even Cumberland View, which some people call Dodge City, which is in North Nashville's public housing, when we started, there were fights daily, shootings, all of these things. But bringing the community together when a harm is caused, even if it's between two people, if anybody else is impacted, we're bringing as many people together to figure out what can be done to make things right. And there's several different types of interventions. There's several different restorative, healing, justice focused interventions, because it's a way of life, because it's a philosophy. The sky is the limit. You can create so many things. And if you stay within these three principles, then you really make sure that you're definitely focused on healing justice. So the first one was repairing harm. The second is stakeholder involvement. And the third is that transformational justice piece, that there has to be community and government transformation. You can't just see transformation in the individual lives of people, but it's got to put power in the hands of the people. Got to put power in the hands of the people. And restorative justice naturally does that, because it is the people who are facilitating the circles. They're sitting in the circles. They're figuring out, what does community safety look like to us? What does community justice look like to us? What is healing and reparation of harm? What do those things look like to us? And how do we experience those things daily? How do we not experience those things daily? And so we created a diversion program that is community-based restorative justice. It's our violence interruption program. And we focus on community building, violence interruption, community conferencing, which is like restorative circles, and then community self-empowerment, which is, again, like neighborhood organizing, civic engagement. And we spread our services around schools, community, courts, and policing. So I want to talk about schools. What do you think that it takes to have healthy schools and healthy classrooms? When young people, excuse me, I'm actually on vacation. We changed the date and I can hear my baby, and it's hard as a mom to not be able to respond. But what does it take to create healthy schools? What does it take when, first, what does it take to even have a culture within the schools to where the children aren't fighting, where they're able to talk out their issues? When I was a school teacher, I did not know anything about restorative justice. I just knew what I needed as a child, and I tried to create those things. And so every morning we came into the classroom and we circled up. And I would spend a good 30 minutes to an hour every single morning just working on the culture of my classroom, playing games, doing circle questions, team building exercises. And my children may have fought somebody outside of the classroom, but they never fought each other. They never fought each other. And we didn't allow the bullying and the picking and all of those things. And oftentimes, if one fought somebody in another classroom, then somebody else would jump in, and we didn't encourage fighting, but the culture of our classroom was just so close knit. And so in building our school programs, we looked at what does it take, one, to create a healthy school culture. And then when things go wrong, how do we focus on healing justice within the schools so that instead of children being pushed out, sent home, which we know increases their chances of experiencing violence, it increases their contact with police, it increases their chances of participating in criminal activity. Like, there's so many reasons that we should never suspend or expel children. What can we do instead? And so Gideon's Army pushed for metro schools to adopt restorative justice, to change the school policy manual, but then we created these programs that children at Pearl Cone could come to. And what we focused on is, one, always doing circles. So for prevention, bringing the children together, you know, that we knew who might have issues or not be able to do conflict transformation, conflict resolution well, building their social emotional learning skills, and doing absolutely everything that we can do to give children the skill set to be able to handle conflict. But we did the same for the teachers as well. We did teacher trainings at the beginning of the year. Throughout the year, Dr. Sonia Stewart was really good at making sure that the team really focused on social emotional learning. But then when harm was caused, bringing them together, putting them in a circle, and teaching them how to talk things out. So it started out where the children would fight, and then they would fight, and then they would come and sit in a circle. But it began to transform to where they weren't fighting, and they would just come to us instead. So then if we look at community, what Gideon's Army did, we had 72 students from Pearl Cone who focused on youth violence. We did a 2-day workshop and said, you know, what does violence look like in our community? What does it look like in our schools and in our homes? And then they looked at different models, and the model that they liked, they picked 2, and they took the best practices from those models and created their own community-based healing justice model, which is what you see now, the violence interrupters. A lot of people don't know, but it was Pearl Cone students who started the violence interruption program. They created the applications, they interviewed the violence interrupters, they hired and also told those who weren't hired that they were not hired. And so 24 hours of a shooting occurring, we have a trauma responder who goes out, finds the family, triages, we plan funerals, we make sure people have clothes to be buried in, provide food for the repast, we speak at the funerals. If the person doesn't pass away, then we're at the hospitals where, you know, we've actually placed children who have no families, who've been shot, into homes with, like we had one who was a nurse, and they stayed with her until she was able, you know, to get back on her feet and get to her own place. And then within another 24 hours, we make sure that there are no retaliation. So whatever the violence interrupters need to do to prevent retaliation, they go out and they meet with everyone who is involved, who they think might have been involved, and make sure that there's no retaliation. And the program is really, really powerful because just like in the schools, what we're finding is that there is healing that is happening in these communities to where, you know, people will come to the violence interrupters and say, we know what you're working to do in these communities, and we want this healing too. So I'm not going to go and shoot him for disrespecting me, but I need y'all to step in and help us figure something out. And it is so powerful. And that's the power of healing justice. It transforms people's lives, but it also transforms the community itself. So the next 2 that I want to talk about are public safety and courts. And with public safety and the courts, they kind of go hand in hand. Kyle, in his introduction, talked about the Driving While Black report and policing and everything. And so, you know, we do have relationships with the police, but we don't necessarily like just work together. Our programs are separate, but, you know, respected, I guess. Gideon's Army's focus is that we focus on healing justice, and of course, reentry, as many diversions as possible, restorative justice diversions, bringing people to sit in circle, those who are harmed, and figuring out how we can work together to make things right. And so really quickly, I just want to show you, like, what does it look like? So we have circles. We see children in circles. We do youth-led community engagement through theater. This theater of the oppressed. And when we built our program, we did these things. So we put the children in circle. We did focus groups, circled up with families. We engaged the community through theater, just talking about the issues of violence in interactive theater. Then we brought together city agencies, the mayor's office, MNPD, Metro Schools, MDHA, Metro Arts, juvenile courts, to talk about from their perspective what healing justice can look like within the system, even though Gideon's Army is ultimately focused on creating programs outside of the system or alternatives to traditional justice. And again, it was youth led and youth focused. Our youth did a lot of the presentations to the government system partners, as well as to community organizations. And then we brought together the different communities. So North Nashville, KC, and JC Napier communities, so that everything that we do, if we're focusing on healing and we're talking about bringing everybody together who has been impacted, everybody who is involved, then this is the only way to do it. It's not the same, or wouldn't be as impactful if Rasheedat Fetuga says, oh, this is what I think everyone needs, even though I have been impacted by violence. But the importance of the collective voice in creating change can never be undermined. And so we've had a lot of success. And I want to say first that Gideon's Army in our first year invested $354,000 into the North Nashville community. All of our staff was born, raised, lives in North Nashville. That was something that was really important to us, important to the children, because these are credible messengers who have, like, the children, the families, everybody who's a member of, Gideon's Army in leadership. They've all been impacted, like I said at the beginning of the presentation. And so making sure that we invest and hire people from the community who have been impacted was like our number one priority. Gideon's Army also gave over $13,000 in scholarships to students in North Nashville. With our trauma cases that we did, there were over 13 cases in our first year, 40 home visits. We did several victims compensation applications. We even pay for funerals, like, as we have the money, because a lot of people, of course, in North Nashville, they don't have life insurance. They're not, prepared for these things to happen. And so making sure that we support the families as much as possible. But let's look at Pearl Cone. In our first year, our first 4 years, we saw a 77% reduction in suspensions, which was really huge for us. We had 221 school referred behavior interventions. This was 2019 to 2020. We're coming up on our second year now doing this specific program. Students entered our room for interventions and support 772 times. We reduced behavior infractions by 323%. And in this school year, 35 out of 36 of our seniors, they were at risk for not graduating. They graduated. We had 61 families enrolled. At McKissick, which we weren't able to measure as well at McKissick because COVID and the tornado and everything really kind of stopped everything. But we did things a little differently there. We have meditation room. Gideon's Army handles all level 100 and 200 infractions and a lot of the 300 level infractions as well. We have 51 school referred behavior interventions, 25 families enrolled. We saw a 48% reduction in out of school suspensions. And 100% of our students agree Gideon's Army helped me feel engaged, welcome, supported. I fight less. I respond more peacefully. I'm motivated to improve academically. Gideon's Army provided me with a safe space to talk when I needed a listening ear. Gideon's Army helped me or motivated me to stay out of trouble. And because we work with whole families, we're also focused on economic advancement, job advancement, academic advancement for the whole family, making sure that the parents are employed, that their bills are paid. And so the donations that come into Gideon's Army mostly are going like directly to the families that we serve. But then we're also looking at just everything that we can do, like systemically, family focused, community focused on healing and advancement, getting on that path to success. And so the future of Nashville, this is where I need your help. I need you to trust me. I need you to trust yourself and what the community that we work with, what community members are saying as far as the impact. And we can expand this across the city. Like, Nashville can be a model city for healing justice. Like, we are so ready. When I started 10 years ago, there were like this little pocket of people talking about healing justice. There was this little pocket of people talking about restorative justice, but there wasn't a movement for it. And now, like, it's broadly known that people are talking about restorative justice, healing justice, transformative justice, diversion programs, like looking at healing and crime all in a different way. And so pushing the city to be a restorative city and figuring out together what that can look like. And so that is what I'm working on now, is what could Nashville look like as a model for restorative justice? And there are other cities that have created their own models, but Nashville is its own place. And what we do, it needs to look like what works for us. The next thing is to have unarmed mental health first responders or mental health trained first responders. It can be community members who are trained, community volunteers who are trained, but we need unarmed first responders. We also need to invest more on the front end. And so you hear people calling for the defunding of the police, but what that means for us is that you are investing on the front end and creating these healthy communities to where the need for police isn't even there anymore. It's not even there. And I often say that our relationship with police is definitely codependent, because we don't want them. We don't feel safe in a lot of ways. But at the same time, when harm occurs, there's no one else to call. And so we end up calling the people who we don't even know if they will protect us or kill us. And so creating healthy communities, those social determinants of health, that if you were here at the very beginning, looking at healthy schools, healthy environments, physical health, mental health, creating these healthy communities and investing financially in these communities, investing in diversion programs, investing in after school programs, keeping the community centers open longer, making sure that people have health care, making sure the teachers are paid well and that the schools are well funded. All of that has to make sense to at least most people, that we do what is needed on the front end so that there is less of a need for policing and all of those other things on the back end, especially when we know that recidivism is high, which means that people often go back into the justice system who've been through. But in restorative justice programs and those diversions, the recidivism is very, very low. It's very rare that a person will go through a restorative program, a restorative intervention, and go back into the justice system. So harm reduction strategies, we're not criminalizing people for being sex workers, not criminalizing people for being addicted to drugs. How can we bring healing into the lives of people who are struggling on the streets as opposed to incarcerating them? What kind of community-based diversions can we have? And then also looking at community medics. And so how can we invest in the communities, divest from the justice system that's not working? How can we be restorative and focus on healing? And I will say that one reason that this is extremely important is when you have been victimized by a crime, it becomes you, the person who's caused the harm versus the state. And doing this work for so long, what I see is that a lot of times people are re-victimized in the system because they have no power. So they're powerless when they got hurt. They were powerless when they were harmed. And then you go through this justice system and you end up being powerless again because you really have no say in rebuilding your sense of safety. But what if there's an organization, or what if, the community knows how to come together to do grief circles, to come together, bring everybody together to figure out how to repair harm. You've got people responding to calls who are unarmed. And most emergency calls are nonviolent. And so how do we figure this out together to make sure that we're focused on healing Nashville? So I want to thank you for sitting through, this presentation with me today. I'm looking forward to answering your questions. I love you all so much for the support that you all have given little old me, a school teacher, in Nashville, Tennessee, by way of Cincinnati, Ohio, for believing in me and for believing in this mission. If you are new to Rasheedat, if you are new to Gideon's Army, I want to say thank you for being inquisitive, for being here and listening. And let's see what we can create together. Let us have a labor of love that creates something beautiful. Let Nashville be a model city for justice and for healing justice. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Chris Wood, and I'm a member of this church and a member of the Palmer Lecture Action Team. I want to thank Ms. Fetuga for being our lecturer this year, and she will be spending a few minutes after this answering some questions that you've had the opportunity to send in during the lecture. My purpose for being here is to raise money on behalf of the lecture. There should be a button appearing on your screen that you can take advantage of to give a donation to in support of this lecture. And I'd like to make a couple points on that. One is that the lecture is indeed self-funding. It isn't a line item in our budget. And so it's through this offertory that we take at the lecture and the Share the Plate offertory that we do usually in August are the two main funding sources that we have for this lecture. So really need to get your support to keep it going, because I think that the lecture is important. And that brings up my second point, which is that for me, one of the best aspects of the Unitarian Universalist religion is that we want a better world now. And I think that this lecture is one important way of doing that, lifting up a particular human rights area that needs improvement and bringing in somebody to tell us how to do that is a great way to make some progress on it. And although it's a never-ending fight, there's always going to be fights that we have to pursue in pursuit of human rights. One would have to admit that things have improved in many areas of human rights. So let's keep it going, and really appreciate you making a donation to support this lecture and keep it going. Thanks. And also would like to thank the Palmer Lecture Action Committee. We'd like to thank the members of our staff who've worked hard to pull off this virtual lecture. And most especially, we want to lift up Sherry DiGiovanna for her efforts, and without her, this lecture would not have been possible. Thank you, Sherry.